Hello AP Econ students, this is Ms. Haley and welcome back to AP Macro Flip videos. Today we're going to talk about the Phillips curve and how we can connect it to fiscal and monetary policy. So, how is the Phillips curve related to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve? So maybe you all started to notice this when we introduced the Phillips curve last week, but basically the aggregate model and the Phillips curve model are mirror images of each other. This makes sense because if one variable of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is GDP, and if you increase GDP, you have increase in employment. And the x-axis of the Phillips curve is unemployment. And if we see a decrease in unemployment, we see an increase in GDP. Decrease in unemployment means an increase in employment. And so what we're going to see with our short run Phillips curve comparing to our aggregate supply in the short run, they move similarly. The long run aggregate supply and the long run Phillips curve, they also move similarly, but they're all going to be mirror images of each other. So if we see a shift in AD, which could come from what type of policy shift to the right, that would be an expansionary policy. That could be with fiscal or monetary. And what are types of fiscal and monetary steps to achieve expansionary policy? Well, we could have increase in government spending, we could have decrease in taxes, and we could also have the Fed buying bonds. If we have those occur, when we have expansionary policy, we'd see a shift to the right of aggregate demand. So let's just imagine for right now, to understand this connection of aggregate demand shifts and then movement along the Phillips curve, if our long run equilibrium was at point B. If we find that same point on the Phillips curve, we can also understand points on the aggregate demand that are inflationary and see where they also occur on the Phillips curve. So any inflationary gap points would be to the right on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and then on the left, the Phillips curve. We can understand that that correlates because if real GDP is increasing, we would have, and inflation is increasing, we have a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment. Whereas if we saw a recessionary gap on our aggregate model, there is lower price levels and lower real GDP, we would have a point to the right on the Phillips curve where there is increasing unemployment and decreasing inflation. So conclusion from this slide, shifting aggregate demand in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model means movement to a new point along the short run Phillips curve. Versus if we have a shift in aggregate demand, and as we talked about in the last video, if businesses expect that there's monetary policy that will cause inflation, you want to help your business. You don't want to be hit unexpectedly by higher input prices and higher wages. How will you react? You are probably going to lead to a decrease in supply, increase in prices, and this is going to shift our short-run aggregate supply to the left. So if that happens on the aggregate supply model, because businesses are predicting there's going to be monetary policy, this new equilibrium, instead of staying out at this increased output and price level, will go back to the long-run aggregate supply point, back to the long-run employment level, long-run production level. And so with this monetary policy, because there's adjustments in expectations, we as a society are at this higher price level, but original output level. So we can see this mirrored in the Phillips curve. And so starting at this long-run equilibrium, with the inflationary monetary policy, we have an increase in inflation on this axis and a decrease in unemployment. And then when businesses realize or predict that this monetary policy is going to happen, they're going to write shift aggregate supply, which is shift in aggregate supply to the left causes shift to the right of the long-run Phillips curve. Remember, they're mirrored. And so the long-run Phillips curve new equilibrium would be at this higher price level, but original unemployment rates. We can also use our understanding of the mirrored images of an inflationary gap to the Phillips curve to understand where we would place that inflationary gap on our short-run Phillips curve. And so let's say we have our inflationary gap here at a higher GDP, a higher output level than is possible in the long run. And so that point would be here on our Phillips curve. Again, a lower unemployment and higher inflation. And the actual long-run equilibrium, long-run unemployment, and long-run employment that we want to reach as a society is located to the right of the inflationary gap point on the Phillips curve. So what would be a possible active policy to counteract this inflationary gap? So an active monetary policy by the central bank could be buying bonds or selling bonds. It could be increasing discount rates or decreasing discount rates. And it could be increasing or decreasing the required reserve ratio. If we in the society see we're in inflation, the active policy we would want to use is contractionary. And with that, the way that the central bank could achieve contractionary monetary policy would possibly be selling bonds, or it could be increasing discount rates, or it could be increasing reserve ratio. And so that would bring that aggregate demand back to the left, and then that would bring our points back along the Phillips curve to an equilibrium point. Let's look at the same example, or similar kind of example, but with a recessionary gap. So we would see the recessionary gap on our aggregate demand and supply model, that we have a lower GDP and lower price level than is our equilibrium. And if we wanted to use a monetary policy to counteract this, if it was an active monetary policy, or something that the central bank is choosing to change, we might see buying of bonds, or decrease in reserve ratios, or decrease in discount rates. We're not going to talk about it a ton, but if we were using passive monetary policy, that's very similar to when fiscal policy uses auto stabilizers or non-discretionary spending. So instead of the central bank deciding to make something change, there might already be a procedure in place. So if the GDP falls by a certain percentage, that interest rates would also decrease by a certain percentage. And so closing the recessionary gap would try to shift aggregate demand to the right by increasing money supply and decreasing interest rates. And that would bring our recessionary gap back to our long-run equilibrium. Showing this on the Phillips curve, this would be our long-run equilibrium. And if we're in a recessionary gap, that means that unemployment is higher than the natural unemployment and inflation is below. And so if we use that passive monetary policy that's expansionary, we would see a shift to the left on the movement along the Phillips curve. So that point would move along to the left, and we would reach back again in equilibrium. So thank you for today's video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.